I want to welcome you guys to this talk in the Tocqueville Project's Lectures on Liberty series. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Surprenant, and I'm an assistant professor of philosophy here at the University of New Orleans and the director of the Lectures to Tocqueville Project on Democratic Ideals and Institutions. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome to UNO Daniel D'Amico, who is assistant professor of philosophy at Loyola University. Assistant professor of economics at Loyola University. I'm trying to put you in the wrong department. Dan graduated, he got his PhD from George Mason University in economics in 2008. He's published numerous articles in the journals of Public Choice, Advances in Austrian Economics, the Journal of Private Enterprise, and the Review of Austrian Economics. And today he's going to talk to us about Alexis de Tocqueville's view on incarceration. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dan D'Amico.
Thanks, Chris. It's great to be here. It's great to travel to give a lecture without having TSA sort of molest and grope you. I just had to drive from uptown. So what I want to talk about today is how Alexis de Tocqueville viewed the process of incarceration and its role in democratic America in particular. Recently, 2007, James Whitman, who's one of the sort of preeminent criminologists and crime historians, published a paper called What Happened to Tocquevilles America? And I think for the majority of, say, political philosophy students or students of political science, what comes to mind when you think of Alexis de Tocqueville, like what sort of major text pops out? Democracy in America. It's a no-brainer. Alexis de Tocqueville, most accredited with writing, Democracy in America. The book's so good he had to write 2 volumes, right? Released 1835, 1840. But what the title that Whitman is sort of alluding to implies that, well, Tocqueville lived in a certain climate of America, or came to and observed a certain living climate of America in a functioning process of democratic systems, coins this phrase, a delicate art of civil association. And today it seems that there would be significant changes over the course of history. That seems obvious. So one would expect to start reading Whitman's paper and see the traces of this change and explain what their causes and consequences were. But in actuality, Whitman, again, is a criminologist, a crime historian. His paper has very, very little to do with the structurally different political processes or democratic institutions of de Tocqueville's time compared to contemporary America. But it's instead focused on Tocqueville's earlier work, right? A lot of people don't know that in 1833 he published, in its time, it was arguably one of the first pieces similar to Democracy in America, of observational social theory, right? Tocqueville sort of immerses himself in the population, looks out at the behaviors of the individuals he's observing, and the structural patterns, group dynamics of what they're operating within. But his primary function for the trip that he was sent to the United States to perform was drafting on the penitentiary system and its relevance to France with a co-author and good friend of his, Gustave de Beaumont. Again, earlier publication to Democracy in America. And the primary he only spent 9 months in the United States. And the majority of that time was spent actually touring and within prison facilities. And so I think that we often lose sight of this. And this is going to be much more important in my lecture as it progresses. But Whitman's main claim is that incarceration in Tocqueville's time compared to incarceration today are radically different things. If you think that certain democratic institutions were different for Tocqueville than they are today, the sort of incarceral and criminal justice system, significantly different. And in particular, what Whitman is talking about is, wow, isn't it kind of weird that someone of de Tocqueville's caliber, a social theorist, a social scientist of his talent and insight, was sent with explicit sort of attention and mission by the French government at the time to investigate the penitentiary system. What that must say for American criminal justice practices at the time. Whitman even argues that they were sort of the moral benchmark of the globe, because Tocqueville and de Maubant from France were not the only representatives at this time on these sorts of explicit missions to investigate American incarceration facilities. And on the penitentiary system and its application to France was one of 6 significantly thorough social science reports at the time, each geared to sort of different governmental apparatuses in different nations. Within a few decades, the same sort of make and model of incarceration facilities that took place in the United States that were detailed in these reports were mimicked and modeled throughout the developed world, like 10, 20 years. If we had a comparable rate of that technological transmission today, we could arguably solve a significant amount of global poverty that exists, right? The distribution of these forms of technologies was very, very quickly adopted by state governments throughout the developed world in the mid 1800s. So Whitman is arguing, okay, well, in Tocqueville's time, the United States is the moral pinnacle, the sort of gold standard benchmark of criminal justice practices. Tocqueville's description of the facilities is that, well, they're kind of grimy, so to speak. The people inside them kind of disturbed. The social process is kind of problematic. But what's great about them is the elaborate checks and balances of the system that avoid their significant usage, right? It's a last line of defense. And there's a bunch of sort of release valves and checks in the system that keep people from actually being sent there with too much frequency and too much severity. So what's great about the system of incarceration to Tocqueville in Tocqueville's time is how infrequently we use it and rely upon it. How it is actually part and parcel of a broader system of social order and social compliance that doesn't necessarily resolve or revolve or rely upon this sort of heavy-handed coercive apparatus of state punishment nearly as much. Plus, it's also got really noble intentions through the rehabilitation attempt. I mean, it's not on the prison system, it's on the penitentiary system, the root word actually invoking the concept of penitence, the notion of seeking salvation for one's sins and rehabilitating one's soul. So what's the counterpoint for Whitman is America today. So what has become of American incarceration since the time of Tocqueville. Again, the American experience at the time, it's heralded as being very progressive, very sort of mild in its visceral connotations relative to systems of, say, scaffold and spectacle punishment. This is an early observation by social penal theorist Michel Foucault, right? Prisons are very advanced and highbrow relative to guillotines and torture devices on stages. But here we have a one vision of incarceration rates around the globe that shows America at the more severe end of the spectrum. We incarcerate a lot more people than most other countries around the world. In fact, any other country around the world. And we're going to look at some sort of explicit proportions. Another way to gauge the sort of severity of criminal punishment operating within the United States relative to other countries is by looking at the frequency and use of capital punishment, so death penalties. We are one, if not one of very, very few remaining first world economies, societies that persistently use and rely upon death penalty in a variety of forms. Arguably on the decline globally, on a sort of like steady foothold in the United States. Again, the proliferation of incarceration facilities, right? Since, say, as close as we have reasonable data to Tocqueville's period, right? So 50 years prior to this, even less significant, right? We have less Western development. We had a few significant facilities in major metropolitan areas, but as time progresses, by the year 2000, we're really sort of in a viral incarceral model of state and federal facilities. And the colors here sort of reflect the year these facilities opened, so you can get all the way back to sort of the Tocqueville's time. Direct expenditures, the sort of financing model of criminal justice more generally, represents, again, compared to Tocqueville's conception, prisons are effective in the United States insofar as they are infrequently relied upon. Here we see how the financing aspect of the criminal justice system is radically changing proportions in the latter part of the 20th century and early part of the 2000s. Mainly that as a proportion of total criminal justice spendings, corrections has radically increased its significant ratio. There's a lot of criminological theory that's concerned about this. We used to have a much more community-based policing model, which I think would dovetail well with Tocqueville's understanding of civil society, insofar as police used to sort of deter crime before it took place by enmeshing themselves in the community, walking the street, being a part of day-to-day operations. Whereas now we sort of, after crime takes place, retributively respond by means of punishment. And that's indicative of these forms of financing, changes in financial proportions. Net prison population, again, sort of 1850, right? Now, this is not necessarily controlled for population. This is net population. But it's certainly a remarkable trend relative to the proportions, or at least like the duration in which the low trends akin to Tocqueville's time, right, persisted. We had some significant amount of persistent, stable social order prior to this massive surge of incarcerated populations. Again, in the international context, we see the United States as a radical outlier compared to any other developed nation. And in fact, combining all other developed nations, we still sort of dwarf them. Luckily enough, it's like we are the best of the best, the sort of super incarcerating state of the super incarcerating nation here in Louisiana. We incarcerate more than any other country per capita, just in our state alone, let alone the entire nation. I say this as a sort of a cheer, but it's kind of freaky and very problematic, especially in the context of Tocqueville. Now, why is it that these trends, these facts, bring such concern to people like Whitman, bring such concern to people like myself, bring such concern to anyone who's interested in liberty, per se? And I think it's because it's very difficult to argue that the trends of mass incarceration, especially in the United States, are efficient or even stable or sustainable. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, one sort of attitude would be we should have a greater amount of incarceration if we had a significant greater population and incidence of crime amongst this time trend. And while that is potentially true, significant crime increases since the 1960s, what the mass incarceration trend is really bad at accounting for is this significant decline since the 1990s. Mostly because these criminogenic trends, the trends of crime surges as well as decline, are shared by most other advanced Western democracies that do not share our incarceral approach, right? So we're radically beyond the incarceration level of, say, England and Canada, yet England and Canada also have experienced this significant decline in violent crime. Now, is it likely that some proportion of that violent crime decline is a result of, say, deterrence and incapacitation accomplished through prisons? Yes. But the question is whether or not, I mean, in economics terms, whether or not that's worth it, whether or not some proportion of that modest decline accounts for that sort of extreme cost increase, especially when other nations are accomplishing these significant crime declines without necessarily affording the same expenses, locking up the same proportion of people. Furthermore, 1960 is a very small sliver of time in American history to look at relative to back to de Tocqueville's period and earlier, right? So the graph that we just showed from 1960 until 2000 is this hump here, but in the context of understanding violent crime in American history more broadly, we see this massive decline before we even really invent and materialize the concepts of incarceration. We also have to wonder, given the sort of claim of this would make sense amidst increased crime, amidst increased population, why it is that the majority of prison space is allocated for drug war violations in this new growth rather than protections of person and property. So if we had a model where incarceral space was this sort of needed and necessary role of promoting social order, it doesn't necessarily make fit within that framework that incarcerating for drug offenses is necessarily the same, serving the same functional role. We also have significant concerns regarding the structural features of incarceration, mainly that it's predominantly affecting on younger generations. In fact, this is one of the major sort of articles that brought attention to the issues of incarceration and issues of crime more generally was an article by criminologist John DiIulio, actually titled something like, "Dear Economists, Please Pay Attention to Crime, We Need Your Help." And it was basically an admission that at the time the criminal justice field was understaffed by sophisticated statisticians in the late 1980s. And sure enough, crime from that 1960 to 1980 period was on this surge. And John DiIulio described this crime trend as being particularly young and particularly violent. Okay, so the way I explained it to my student, it was like the Foot Clan from Ninja Turtles. He was afraid that these new criminal agents in their young years who were being more violent in their criminal activities would grow up to continuously be violent criminals, get replaced by another new generation of younger, more violent criminals, and then they would sort of like plague our streets and be a criminal sort of zombie apocalypse out in American streets. And so he was like, we've definitely got to fix this. We've got to draw attention to these topics and issues. But then, sure enough, in the mid-1990s, crime goes on this significant decline. So DiIulio's whole framework, and it was the standard perspective in the field that, man, we're on this peak of this crime surge. We've got to figure this out. And crime starts turning around, even without that being the sort of new period of incarceral growth. Incarceral growth had been sort of marching on and marching on and marching on. And actually, most people were like, whoa, crime rates declined. No one really understood where that came from or why. Here we see, again, by age and gender, male versus female population. So we have adult females are on, it's like the one area that sort of women get a leg up in society. It's like you're not nearly as incarcerated as men are. You don't commit nearly as much violent crime, so you're welcome, I suppose. But we could see sort of juvenile detention rates significantly lower than others. But if we were to zoom in on this line as well, you would get some degree of significant growth within that comparative perspective, let alone the fact that most advanced Western democracies don't necessarily incarcerate juveniles, but treat them through sort of other means of criminal sentencing. Here we see the racial proportions, right? The predominant incarceration is driven by African American and Hispanic men. The sort of recent proverbial comparison is that the average African American man below the age of 35 has a greater likelihood of going to jail than he does getting married or going to college, which is pretty bleak perspective. So what I want to argue here is that there's really two significant things going, or two alternative positions going on that explain the rise of this phenomenon in America today. Whitman, who's arguing, well, this represents a significant moral change in the ethos of American citizens, that we're now sort of punitive and tolerant of these forms of incarceration, that we have stopped being rehabilitative and started being vengeful in our get tough on crime strategy. I don't think that's necessarily right, and I don't think that that's necessarily the insight that we should take from looking at de Tocqueville. What I think is going on instead is precisely that Tocqueville's books were misunderstood. So think of this context. There's two ways of responding to crime. One we could call imposed order or formal criminal justice institutions. In fact, this is exactly what prison systems were designed to do. So to walk through this in economic terms, we have the most common heuristic in social science, the prisoner's dilemma. How many of you guys are familiar with the prisoner's dilemma? Few. So we'll have a refresher / review for you guys and some new insight for those who aren't familiar. Adam Smith said that any individual person is constantly confronted with the choice set to either truck, barter, and exchange or rape, pillage, and plunder. Right? There's two ways to go about getting what you want. You can either cooperate with other people, right, by means of trading voluntarily, right, goods for goods, or you can steal stuff from them. You can sort of beat them up, take what you want, leave no prisoners, so to speak. The prisoner's dilemma captures this trade-off in a way. The narrative associated with the prisoner's dilemma, it's attributed to John Nash, is the notion that when you have two suspects for a crime and you don't have enough evidence to convict either one of them per se, you want to give them an incentive to rat each other out, to defect against each other. So you can isolate them and then sort of promise them that you'll go easy on them, that they'll have a lower sentence if they only explain to you that it was the other guy who did the real sort of masterminding, who did the real sort of violence associated with the crime. What ends up happening is both of the criminals rat each other out. So you don't really have to go easy on either one of them because you've got confessions that inculcate one another. The story, the narrative, it's very charged with like normativity, like cooperate or defect. Like nobody really wants to be a defector. You would rather be a cooperator. So one question becomes, well, like, does the prisoner's dilemma like actually happen, right? How could we promote, if it does plague our society, that people are constantly attuned to this like rape, pillage, and plunder tendency? This is Hobbes's project, right? The state of nature is a constant war of each man against each other man, right? Nasty, brutish, and short. In Smithian terms, this also makes sense. This is the default condition of our social arrangement. If you and I come across one another in like a wooded path and no one's around, and we've never met each other, and we're both confident that like no one could enforce the rule of law in this encounter, and I see your sunglasses, right? Now, I've got money in my wallet that I could say, okay, I'll pay you $5 for your sunglasses. Or I could just beat you up and take your sunglasses. If I beat you up and take your sunglasses, though, I have $5 and sunglasses, right? Win-win me, lose-lose you, right? If I give you $5 and take your sunglasses, I'm down the $5 and up the sunglasses. So we can see that it's always and everywhere sort of cheaper and more beneficial for me to beat you up and take your stuff rather than pay you for it. It's only in the context of, well, a concern about external penalty, a concern about, well, if somebody catches me, if I get sort of arrested or penalized for doing this sort of behavior. So what the prisoner's dilemma demonstrates is, look, in a situation where both players cooperate, each player will be awarded with $2, right? But if one player defects against the other, right, he'll get $3 and the other person gets $0. The same inverse incentive is promoted to and explained to the other player. And they're in isolation with one another. So insofar as pure economic reasoning would say $3 greater than $2. I'll take 3, please, thank you. But what happens is if both defect, they both only get $1. We can admit that if we had some external enforcement, if we had some sort of thing that slapped our hand every time we defected, if we had some way to get us back to cooperate, that we would each have not only more money than we end up with, but collectively the most amount of money in any cell, right? So this is sort of Hobbes's question. Hobbes is saying, okay, well, we need this external enforcement. We need this mechanism in our society, this formal institution of law enforcement to induce people to overcome this sort of inherent bias towards raping, pillaging, and plundering, and converge instead upon cooperating and associating with one another. Now, that's the individual level. The aggregate level, right? We have, there's an entire literature on what's called self-enforcing exchange. It's part of what's called new institutional economics. And basically what they notice is that, you know, this prisoner's dilemma challenge is especially difficult when it comes to large anonymous groups, right? I don't need the police, right? I don't need a prison system and a court system and a formal system of criminal justice in order to keep my mother from defecting on her promises to me, right? Yet, that I know of, right? I mean, I've only had to call the police on her like twice, and she's usually very compliant. I'm just joking.
She's just never compliant.
Exactly. So in small, like, and this is sort of like Hayek has an argument in The Fatal Conceit. It's very similar. If we ran our family the way we run society, it would be a really weird family, right? If I said, like, if I had to pay $3 growing up to get Fruit Loops in the morning from my parents, it would be very awkward. Contrary, if we ran society like we run our family, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, right? When I'm sick, I get more parental attention. When my brother's sick, he gets more parental attention. It's not, oh, you mowed the lawn very well today, like you get paid in proportion to your product. You took the day off, oh, you get less. We need different sort of rule systems to operate in each of these settings. So prisoners' dilemmas really inhibit the probability for autonomous trade in large group heterogeneous societies, right? Manhattan, huge scale environments. Small scale homogeneous groups, right? Me, my mother, our family, right? We can cooperate with one another. We can solve the prisoner's dilemma, so to speak, without exogenous enforcement, without a formal system of rules and compliance and so on and so forth. But as we grow, either a larger family, right? People will disagree on the margins, right? Or a more diversified group, we run into trouble. Now, political processes, right? Hobbes's resolution, the Leviathan state, the democratic procedure, right? Is often aimed specifically at doing this, right? Resolving these sorts of conflict by means of voting, representation, election, etc. But the opposite insight can also be interpreted, right? If prisoners' dilemmas are hard to solve here and we need democratic processes the most in these environments, for argument's sake, imposing democratic processes in these sorts of groups can be downright destructive, right? And what comes to my mind is I was an advisor for a fraternity, like the second year I was teaching at Loyola. Worst mistake I ever made. It was like 12 white guys who went to Loyola, right? And every time they had an election, who's going to be president, who's going to be vice president, who's going to be treasurer, it turned into a soap opera of the most elaborate drama. And so I couldn't help but think about how these are like 12 little clones of one another for all intents and purposes, right? They don't have that variety of skill sets or that variety of personalities to the point where if we had a selection process to pick the president and we got the second best, it wouldn't be the end of the world, right? Because there's all of 12 candidates and they have like similar backgrounds, similar socio-demographic income, similar characteristic traits, similar incomes, similar educations, similar, like, they're the same person for all intents and purposes. If we fudge and put the wrong guy in presidential office, the organization is going to puddle along as much as it can. So the transaction costs of administering these sort of hatred-filled elections where they would like complain about one another and out each other as being bad people and talk ill of one another was just destroying the institution. And I think that you would just as much as imposing a monetary system in a family order, right? Imposing a rigid democratic system in a small-scale homogeneous group is also probably strange. So what I want to suggest is that Tocqueville's Democracy in America and his entire project associated with drafting that book, as well as investigating the penitentiary system in the United States, sits in opposition to this formalistic perspective of resolving prisoner's dilemma. Now, and this isn't an insight unique to me. F.A. Hayek in Law, Legislation, and Liberty, for example, puts in dire contrast the characters of Jeremy Bentham with Alexis de Tocqueville as representing two distinctive traditions within the broader individualist natural law perspective. Bentham represents an ability or a belief in the relationship between man's reason and the natural law. In cheap caricature, it goes something like this. If law is natural, right, and man is part of nature, then the laws that man can come up with must also be natural. So what we need to do is quantify and make technical the sort of incentives and manipulations of man's behavior. That's the Benthamite sort of version, what he called calculative and constructed individualism. In contrast, what I'm going to explain is de Tocqueville's perspective is a much more organic and evolutionary form of individualism. Mainly that there is a system of, say, natural law, and whatever rules and policies get placed upon that are only functional and sustainable insofar as they meld well with that underlying order. So, however, to look at what Bentham subscribes, Bentham explicitly designs the Panopticon, the architectural design features of what prisons de Tocqueville was actually investigating. And the whole idea of the Panopticon, the sort of, this is a new technology. Like if you got caught committing crimes circa 1500, they didn't necessarily send you to jail. They would do things to you, there were punishments, but the concept of putting you in a cell as an individual, measuring your punishment in the course of the passage of time, and continuously observing you within that cell is a very new, innovative potential to the Enlightenment, to Bentham. In economic terms, we call this the principal-agent problem. Principal-agent problem is basically summed up as job ain't nothing but work, right? I have an office. I leave the door open. When my dean walks by is when I look the most busy, right? I've got to pretend like I'm writing something profound, like I'm grading papers and reading tests. The second he gets out, I bring back up the like YouTube videos of cats playing poker. Right? It's called shirking, right? If you're an assembly line worker, you're lazy, you're lackadaisical, you go as slow as possible. It's a wait out the clock situation. The minute the foreman walks by, you look busy, right? Bentham says, this is a problem. It's a problem in all the workhouses, all the assembly lines, all the nursing homes, and all the penitentiaries. If only we had a way to continuously monitor, or at least to instill the belief that the people who were on the assembly line were being continuously monitored. Panopticism, all-seeing, right? That they would constantly feel like they were under the surveillance of the onlooker, then they would conform to the maximum amount of effort for the production if they were in a factory, for the compliance of social behavior if they were in a penitentiary. Bentham literally subtitles his book. He's a Panopticon, a design scheme for, he was like, this could work in nursing homes, this could work in factory houses, this could work in a prison system, so on and so forth. The architects that take it most seriously are prison designers. And again, the majority of the facilities that Tocqueville toured, right, reflected some principle of this argument of resolving the principal-agent problem. Having a central observational sector, right? This is a one-story design where it's basically a hub-and-spoke model, an asterisk. So you could keep your guards here, and if you had all of these individuated cells, you could look down just the one corridor and know whether or not any of the individual members were sort of making a ruckus or sticking their arms outside of the cell doors or escaping or any such thing. So it was not only an effective means of overcoming principal-agent problems, it was a very cost-effective means of monitoring lots of behavior from a single sort of labor unit. This is Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. It's still there. De Tocqueville toured this specific facility, later served home to Al Capone. They still have his cell. It's got like a fancy chair in it. It's nicer than my apartment. So, how is it that Tocqueville represents a counter-thesis to Bentham's. In other words, I think Whitman's not reading Tocqueville in context well enough. Whitman's arguing, okay, these significant sea change between Tocqueville's America, where we rarely used prisons, right, and contemporary America, where we use prisons a whole bunch, misses out on a number of things. It misses out on the fact that prisons were just invented when Tocqueville came here. It misses out on the fact that Tocqueville writes 2 books, not just on the penitentiary system, but then later Democracy in America. So my interpretation of Tocqueville's sort of experience in drafting both of these books goes something like this. He gets sent to investigate the penitentiary system. If you look at the introductory sections of both Democracy in America and on the penitentiary system, they contextualize the American experience with regard to other nations that were advanced and developed at the time. Tocqueville was basically saying, look, the whole world has gone batty, right? Most of Europe is mired in political upheaval, military engagement, economic decline, high unemployment, and internal crime rates within their environment. In contrast, the United States at the time, a newly developed nation of farmer, slack-jawed, hillbilly, weird Puritan people, were from all across European continent, right? Samples of individuals who otherwise were fighting back in their home countries in Europe amidst one another, but when intermingling in the United States experience, were relatively getting along, right? The United States in its early development had significant amounts of peace, cooperation, economic development, avoidance of military engagement, relative to most of the other developed world at the time. Tocqueville's saying, this is my puzzle, what gives? The fact that him, de Beaumont, and dozens of other developed national political representatives were all investigating these brand new, invented, and constructed prison facilities, I think is indicative of the presumption that it was these mechanisms that were responsible for promoting the unique forms of legal compliance and social order in the United States, right? In other words, the United States and Britain. Britain had like 1 to 2 of the early facilities, and the United States had about a half a dozen of them. They were the only places that these things were located in. It's sort of a false belief to herald them as sort of moral innovations at the time. In a new country that was open to new experimentation, Whitman fails to recognize that, you know, they were the only places that had these new things. And so people were fascinated by the new architecture, but more so by the perception that this sort of behavioral compliance at the social level was actually working, right? That Bentham describes it as, it's like a delicate incentive machine that unties the Gordian knot of incentive compatibility in our society. If everyone walks around knowing that your personal penalty will be designed directly upon you and the circumstances of your crime, then it has an ability to sort of, again, it's not just a panopticism of the internal design features of the facility, but it's a form of panopticism that gets accomplished throughout the social world more generally. We will comply our behavior to make sure that we do not commit crime. One of the big problems for Bentham, I actually think Bentham is a fantastic price theorist, because he foresees what's called the Alton and Allen effect hundreds of years prior to UCLA economist Armin Alton, who recently just passed away, develops it. Alton and Allen effects are the notion of, if you have 2 goods or services with a constant transaction cost, you tend to opt for higher quality goods and services. This is why married people with children go to operas more so than they go to movie theaters. Even though movie theaters are cheaper than a night out at the opera, but if you're paying a babysitter either way, you're giving up fewer units of going to the movie in order to get a unit of opera if you're married with children compared to someone who's single without children. Another way to think of this is shipping costs, right? If you're trying to get lobster from Maine, right, you've got to have a big truck with I don't know anything about shipping lobster, but probably have like a tank and like filtration and air conditioning, and that's a whole bunch of expenses. So once you've fronted all those costs, I doubt that you're going to say, all right, give me the littlest lobsters because I spent all this money and I want to economize, right? You're probably going to say, well, since I have to spend these costs anyway, give me the biggest, bestest lobsters that you can fit on this darn thing because I got to try to make some of this money back. The Alton and Allen effect in the context of crime that Bentham was concerned about, again, another justification for his model of incarceration, was the question of criminality. If the criminal sentence, the punishment for any crime is beheading, you inadvertently incentivize criminals to commit the most heinous crimes that they can get away with, presuming that they gain value from the more heinous that the crime is. If I steal $5 from you or $10,000 from him, but I pay the same penalty either way, you rest assured I'm stealing $10,000 from him. So getting the magnitude of criminal penalties correct is this very delicate process, and there's a dangerous potential in getting it wrong, and that's part of the inspiration for Bentham's design. But again, it's a formal mechanism that's sort of constant, pervasive. It also is a very different structure of incentives and social compliance than what Tocqueville comes up with. We already mentioned that Tocqueville coins this phrase in his drafting of Democracy in America, the civil art of association, right? He doesn't call it the civil mechanisms of association. He doesn't call it the civil design of association. He calls it an art form, as though you've got to practice, as though you've got to actually participate in it to be good at it. I mean, I interpret, Tocqueville didn't write Democracy in America first. He wrote on the penitentiary system first, quickly, 1833. He then essentially locks himself in his attic, again, a form of confinement of his own choosing, and drafts Democracy in America. Nobody asked him to write Democracy in America. It's twice as long as the penitentiary system report. My impression is he was like, here's what you paid me to write, but I've got to get all of this other stuff on paper because you guys have the whole process backwards. You guys think that it's this new machine of social compliance that inspires social order in the new world. It's not. You know what Tocqueville thought it was they like to join clubs. They like to hang out. They like to participate with one another. They like to actually experience community. They like to show up at town meetings. They like to write letters to one another. It was this delicate art of association that was inspiring and sort of promoting progress and advancement and peace and tolerance in the American experience relative to these machines of constructed formalistic coercion that were being investigated. And what I would like to suggest is that in light of things like the prisoner's dilemma paradox and in a lot of forms of contemporary institutional economics, there's a lot of evidence to support Tocqueville's claim that yes, what really drives social order and prosperity and should make us reflect on the cost-benefit ratio of mass incarceration in America today is these informal processes, these delicate arts of association. This first work in 1981 is the first empirical and sort of technical formulations of the prisoner's dilemma. Axelrod takes the mathematical notations of the prisoner's dilemma and tries to stack the deck against himself. Tries to say, okay, let's not play the prisoner's dilemma with ordinary people. Let's play it with like total assholes, right? Let's only have egoists, people who gain no sense of utility from other people's betterment and only senses of utility from their own betterment. What do we see happen in the context of the prisoner's dilemma? Well, first and foremost is in the math, it just comes out, right? Mutual defection, right? So Vernon Smith recently won the Nobel Prize for pioneering work in experimental economics. Experimental economics is when we actually allow undergraduates, just like you, to sort of come into a laboratory setting and participate in economic situations, like the prisoner's dilemma, and see what actually happens. Now, again, we said defection, cooperation, the prisoner's dilemma. These are loaded normative terms. So when we do it in the experimental lab, what we have to do is sort of purge all that normativity, make it very positive. It's pretty straightforward. You guys go into separate rooms, and you've got a blue button and a red button. It's not the Matrix, but it's sort of, right? You can push the blue button, and he can push the blue button, and then you would both get $3. But if you push the red button and he pushes blue, then you get the 4 and he gets 0. And if he does it vice versa, then he gets the extra money. And if you both push red, then you both get the least amount of money. And they actually pay you to sort of play these games. Sure enough, they bring in a bunch of undergrads, they start playing the game, and the answer isn't 0 cooperation, like the math predicts. like the formal economic, rational, sort of calculative action, it's not zero. It's significant minority, right? It's not that people innately cooperate always or the majority of times. It's a minority of times, less than 50%, but it's significant minority, anywhere from 20 to 40% depending on the context of the experiment and the nature of the agents in the system and so on and so forth. But even that is puzzling, right? Economists were like, therefore, rational choice is stupid. The first sort of insight was, prisoner's dilemma must not be true. It predicts perfect defection, always and everywhere. But you guys, significant rates of some cooperation. Well, Vernon Smith, right, usually whenever you pioneer a field, there's like a cottage industry of people who screw up your insights. So you spend a lot of time basically telling people, no, you don't get it. Vernon's great on this because he's just constantly reminding experimental economists, no, you don't get it. Basically what he's saying is that you didn't really control all that you would have had to control for in order to get the people to have complete defection. In other words, I can't give you a personality lobotomy before you come in, well, not according to IRB protocol, before you come into the laboratory setting, right? You were born into a family, you went to kindergarten, you were told to like share and cooperate, you were probably put on team sports, like all these things. Then you come into the lab and we're shocked that you're not a total selfish, greedy bastard. Like, it takes a certain kind of stupid economist to be like, what do you mean he's not willing to sell out all of his humanity for $3? Like, surely that makes sense of the human condition. So Vernon's not surprised by these results. He says, yes, this makes sense. Now the question becomes, what can we do to it? So the first experiment, you guys were anonymous. You never got to talk with one another. We just brought you in, blue, red, push the button, go for it, you're done. Here's your cash. Thank you. Have a nice day. Gordon Tullock said, well, I wonder what would happen if you let them talk for, I don't know, 30 seconds or so before they go in to play the game. Because what do you mean? Just let them introduce each other in the room. Put them in the same room for about 30 seconds, then call them in separately. And you'd go, oh, hey, I'm Mike. And oh, hey, I'm Steve. What's going on? Oh, you're going to play an experiment. I hear that you get paid. That's weird. All right, we're ready for you, Mike. And then come in. And then they say, oh, you're playing against that guy, Steve. Here's the rules. Mutual cooperation jumped from significant minority to significant majority, right? We broke the 50% margin. Right? Wasn't perfect, wasn't unanimous. You still get the occasional jerk who's like, yeah, $4, haha, sucker. Right? But mutual cooperation was really easy to accomplish. 30 seconds of conversation. Right? It was like, oh, I like that guy. I know that guy. Come on. Right? Other ways in which we increase mutual cooperation in the laboratory setting was things like let them play again. Right? You played once, one person defects, the other person cooperates. If you keep playing, right? There's this process where you build trust, where you can signal that you're eager to mutually cooperate later. Right? Axelrod really surveys all of these things, right? Basically, again, if there's any, like I try to play mini forms of really bad controlled experiments with my undergrad students. So after the midterm, I'll throw two of them outside and then accuse them each of cheating and then let them try to defect one another. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. The results are mixed. The results are comparably mixed as Axelrod's findings. How are they comparably mixed? Well, if you pick people in the same fraternity, they tend to cooperate with one another. If you pick siblings, they tend to cooperate with one another. If you pick people in opposite fraternities, they defect really easily. If you pick people who don't even know each other, it's sort of like a gamble. But again, we have this accumulated evidence that mutual cooperation is not impossible without exogenous enforcement. And in fact, it's really easy to accomplish with just mild forms of civil association. Williamson and Karikas, two lovely ladies, personal friends, working on a fascinating research project about informal institutions. There's this thing called the Economic Freedom Index of the world. Has a lot of subvariables trying to measure what makes a nation economically free. One of the variables is the enforcement and protection and security of private property rights. So what they do is they put that as the explanatory variable. Right? They say, how do we understand what contributes to stable, enforced private property rights in an environment? Right? How do we make sure that people aren't raping, pillaging, and plundering one another? And the two things that they're trying to see which is more influential, one is the formal functions of a legal court system, right? So they look at things like the judicial system indices that exist amongst political scientists. And they say, okay, how correlated is that with stable, sound property rights? Compared to the cultural values survey. The cultural values survey asks people questions about the culture of their environment. Do you trust your neighbors? Are you in charge of your own fate? Do you think that society rewards people fairly or unfairly? It tends to be that like certain countries score high on these cultural value surveys and other countries score very low. Sure enough, what they find is that the cultural value survey is a better predictor on private property rights protection than is the formal institutions of criminal justice and contract enforcement. Another set of interesting insights come from Diego Gambetta and Peter Leeson. These guys study criminal organizations. Diego Gambetta studies the hierarchical orders that are found in the Sicilian mafia. Peter Leeson studies pirates. His book is called The Invisible Hook. It's a play on Adam Smith's Invisible Hand. It's about pirates with hook hands. But basically what they both notice is that even amongst these communities of relative assholes, these communities of rational egoists, these people who would steal, rape, pillage, and plunder, they wear it as a badge of pride in themselves, manage within their communities to come up with constitutional constraints, elaborate forms of social order hierarchies with articulated rule systems that are based upon evolutionary trial and error sort of tactics of what works and what doesn't. They're contextual to the circumstances at hand, so on and so forth. Skarbek is arguably doing the same thing as these guys, but his sample is prison gangs specifically. So within the confines of the prison, we have a significant question, a challenge, a puzzle, given the formal beliefs of, say, Bentham's Panopticon model. Within the prison system, what would the appropriate incentive really be other than this sort of all-seeing perspective? Sykes goes back to the early part of the 20th century. He said, look, they had complete solitary housing facilities, the original Panopticons. You could not even interact with other inmates. They would hood your head before they would take or transport you anywhere, walk you around wrong places to confuse you, try to cloud the facility with noise so that you couldn't communicate to other people, totally deprive you of any interaction with traditional society. And yet Sykes found that there were elaborate systems of underground, essentially, communication. The inmates would develop Morse code signaling across amidst the pipes of the facility. He said, basically, the metaphor that prison facilities are not brick walls so much as they are cell membranes. You cannot stop the flow of information and communication amidst these walls and amidst these people. No matter how sort of viscerally isolating the facility is designed or accomplished. And in fact, the mismatch, again, if you have a warden who's too harsh on this unstoppable underlying economy and society, then you will breed tension, and that becomes Sykes's entire theory of where prison riots originate. That when you have too heavy-handed overlords like totalitarian and authoritarian rule schemes, that it's incompatible with the otherwise unstoppable social order amongst the inmates. Skarbek is also, he's similarly finding in California prison systems today very comparable forms of constitutional constraint and innovation and rule systems that emerge in order to mitigate violence, in order to maximize trade revenues, in order to divvy social hierarchies. There's another really good book by Marek Kaminsky. He was incarcerated in Soviet Poland during the 1980s for publishing anti-communist literature. And he was like a geeky political science kid in jail as a political prisoner, and figured out like an elaborate social system, writes his game theory thesis on describing how it is that these inmates managed to pass time by innovating products, by telling jokes with one another. Like, he said that he was protected because people saw the innate value in his joke telling, even though he wasn't big and strong and couldn't protect himself. And so you could make fun of really big guys, and other really big guys would be like, well, we don't have television or anything, so this guy's hilarious, leave him alone. If you break his teeth, he won't tell funny jokes tomorrow, and it'll be really boring. So all of these contexts conform to this significant degree of, say, rational choice, strategic decision making that conforms a lot to the potentials of building civil society associations amidst even the most harsh conditions, right? The aspects of actual trade, exchange, and production actually serve as a form of social space to harbor secondary rounds of civil association. And so in this trade-off between formal and informal institutions, it doesn't seem necessarily that the marginal benefits of an additional prison cell in contemporary America are getting us much, say, social security in terms of promoting social order. In fact, they could be deleterious to that. The entire experience of incarceration, especially when you look at some of these observations, is that the extreme conditions of scarcity impose or breed a form of institutional response that are very, very harsh, right? You have hierarchies delineated on sexual power, right? That's problematic, right? And again, we said the prison cell is not necessarily a brick wall, but a membrane. People come in and out, paroles get released. The strategies necessary and deployed in these forms of environment would make you a very bad member of our conventional society, right? Another way of thinking of it, anybody watching Walking Dead? Greatest show on television. The rest of you, I don't know what you're doing. But it's about the zombie apocalypse. Chilling season this year. They find a prison facility. Turns out prison facilities are great at surviving the zombie apocalypse, right? It's barricaded, it's barbed wire, there's all these like fenced systems, there's all these protocols of closing off different parts of it, right? However, I doubt, right, if something is well tooled to survive the zombie apocalypse, it's necessarily a value added in promoting social order and civil society, right? By definition, the inmates that they end up finding in there are actually very bad at trying to figure out a way to signal that they're trustworthy, right? The one guy's like, I like motorcycles, I'll help you change like, he's desperate because everything is tied to whether or not they can overcome the cooperation problems in their group, that they need to sort of find other people to help them survive. And so, I mean, that's sort of the basis of what I'm saying, is that these sort of machines of law enforcement were designed to accomplish something very, very different from what the societal needs of social cooperation and social order necessarily are. One was designed in order to induce a form of compliance that, if Tocqueville's right, is not the way things work at all, right? They are not necessarily incubators of vibrant social and civil society. They are instead harbingers of deterrence, of incapacitation, of isolation, right? By definition, an antisocial process. That's all I've got. We have time for questions, Chris?
Absolutely. Please, when you ask your question, pause for a second and then speak up so the microphones in the ceiling can pick you up.
Teaching conflict resolution at an early age, is that a productive, delicate art of association?
I think so. I mean, I think participatory conflict resolution is very important. Awkward example, but one that I'm familiar with, is gender differences in ape species. There's a really interesting book called Peacemaking Amongst Primates by Ernst van der Waal. And so within various different ape species that are like our closest genetic relatives, there's very little time spent between both genders, right? The girls hang out with the girls and the boys hang out with the boys, especially in like the larger apes, gorillas, etc. And what this means is that on a per marginal rate, the men are more violent with one another, right? They horseplay, they wrestle, they fight, etc. In those interactions. There's natural rates of like anger and like genuine hostility. It transitions from horseplay to violent conflict. So therefore, there's adaptive strategies at ameliorating violent conflict. In fact, he argues that like a lot of like kissing, hugging, patting, touching, like those are adaptive strategies at signaling like, oh, you got really mad, I'm not really mad, I'm trying to get you to stop being really mad by deploying behaviors that are totally associated not with anger, right? Sex, happiness, love, laughter, etc. Amongst the female cohorts of these ape species, they do a lot less horseplay and sort of violent or dangerous interaction, so they don't have as much practice at these forms of conflict resolution. So there are a lot harsher interactions with outside groups amongst females relative to males. Males do the diplomacy across tribes, so to speak. Right? Because they have this experience of resolving conflicts amongst themselves, when it comes time to meet an outsider, they have this sort of skill set to draw upon. Whereas the like close-knit communities amongst the female cohorts are far more like, you're not in the club, get away, like we only hang out with these people. Mark Granovetter is an economic sociologist. He has a paper called The Strength of Weak Ties. It makes similar points, but with regard to market economies, that in the past, we used to have to rely upon our small homogeneous networks for a lot of our material consumption. If you wanted to borrow money, you basically had to know a guy who directly had that. But now you can travel the world and go into a bank and have full faith and confidence that like that guy's not going to embezzle all your money. That's remarkable in the course of animal kingdom, human civilization, anything is just remarkable. And we take it for granted. And so one thing is like trying to plan and construct that anonymous order, right? Might breed like a sort of degree of like anti-human agents, right? We actually incubate people who are bad at building civil associations. There's a lot of network theory that sort of talk about this, but I think we have like a strange society where problems amongst children, it's like tell a teacher, like outsource, right? Bring in an authority. But I mean, older generations are like, no, we solved our own problems and stuff, and that worked better. I mean, that's a lot of what I think some of this evidence alludes to.
Speaking of outsourcing, can I get your thoughts on something that's not directly related to this, which is private prisons, and how you think private prisons are, one, affecting the country, two, affecting some of the statistics you mentioned, maybe Tocqueville's thoughts on private prisons?
What I like about the animosity that discussions about private prisons invoke, and typically what the content of that animosity is that it's really, really creepy that we have these things, right? That there are private companies that profit off of providing prison space, that they profit off of high crime rates, that they make money off of putting human beings in cages. What I like about the activism in response to this practice is how much they point that out. Because what I think is true about that process is also true about governments that produce and administer prisons, right? There's no substantively different behavioral assumptions about the prison guards who work for the state and the prison guards who work for a private corporation. They're both humans. They're both imperfect. They're both incentivized by their own personal well-being and their own sort of paychecks, et cetera. So the notion that an entire network of people could be materially benefiting from high crime rates, right? Could be materially benefiting from greater rates of employment in that industry, from associated industries, right? That's just as true for state-provided police bureaus and wardens and police officers as it is in the private prison industry. And the private prison industry is a very, very small fraction of the federal trends that we're pointing out. And in fact, they're predominantly subsidized or contracted by governments mostly at the federal level. The majority of private prisons are built for maximum security facility reasons, as well as to enforce immigration codes. Like the Immigration and Nationalization Services is the largest purchaser of private prison facilities. So again, this is much less of an issue of like private companies coming in and sort of displacing local indigenous communities or something, or the rule of law within local governance. And it's much more an issue of, on the margins, strapped states with low tax revenues needing some sort of efficiency gain. And secondly, an ability for federal governments to be able to afford a larger and more expansive criminal justice regimen. So I mean, in economic theory, there's what's called public choice tradition. Public choice is the notion that, again, we can treat political agents as rational actors, that they predominantly act for their own self-interest, that they predominantly act to get reelected, and that there are certain predictable patterns of policy and bureaucratic action that take place therein. One of the biggest things is that stimulus spending or new fiscal injection into the economy creates new interests, right? So it's one thing to have a model of government spending, and it's another thing to have that model of government spending within a particular type of democracy, okay? And this is something that I think is again, relevant to Tocqueville. So we can imagine a macroeconomic system that needs juicing up, right? We can also imagine a macroeconomic system that needs stabilization, cooling down, right? Both are part and parcel of, say, Keynesian macroeconomics. What doesn't get endogenized in that model is the nature of the democracy that it operates within. So if on Monday you say, okay, we're going to spend a bunch of extra money, right, because we need it in a particular sector, right, whether it's prison space, road space, infrastructure, bridges, schools, whatever. Once you spend that money, there are people associated with it, humans. They now are newly incentivized to maintain that spending flow, grow it, hire more people, expand their bureau, right? Vote to support continuous rounds of spending. If the need for the cooling off is a function of previous rounds of spending, we might not have the political processes to take those necessary pills, right? The economic model might say, hey, you should do strategy ABC. That could be true, but then the populace, the political democracy that we live in might say, well, we don't want to do A, B, and C because that's not really like within my interests. I'd rather vote for X, Y, Z. And so then you end up on this sort of like continual path of spending and debt leverage. In Tocqueville's terms, again, I think that it's bizarre for people like Whitman to attribute Tocqueville as saying like, you know, the social institutions in his day in America, they were like this great kumbaya moral reflection of like social tolerance and whatnot. When I read Tocqueville, I interpret him as saying, it's remarkable that everyone's getting along at all. That mostly the different civic groups in the United States didn't much like each other all that much, right? Like the Irish hated the Scots, and the Scots hated the English, and the English hated the Italians, and so on and so forth. And so when it came time for designing like larger scale federal institutions, et cetera, the question was, how can we, how would I design a rule if I was the other guy worried about me? Because I know that if I had the opportunity, I'd screw over that guy. And so rules were about limiting different forms of power. It wasn't a sort of collective unity or a compromise that brought about good constitutional issues in Tocqueville's time. It was instead a functionality of interests checking one another. And I think that that's actually very corrupted by the forms of centralized power that are created by things like the criminal justice system, and also by just like the massive amounts of sort of spending that take place in contemporary America today.
As you're talking, I'm thinking Marlon Gussman. And I just wondered, can you speak to the consent decree? I just am interested in what you think about the consent decree. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it worth the money? Is it not worth the money, as the mayor suggests?
I'm not familiar enough to comment on it. Could you sort of summarize like a definition for what you mean?
Well, there are 2 consent decrees that the city has signed off on: the police consent decree and the jail consent decree, both to address a number of unconstitutional practices. And what the mayor's arguing now is that, okay, he agreed to the police consent decree, and then Gussman, with the DOJ, agreed to the jail consent decree, and now the mayor is looking at it and saying, wow, we can't afford all of that. I'm not real familiar with the content of the jail consent decree, and I don't know if you are.
I mean, my impression is that these things just straight up sound unconstitutional. Like the 20th century, for example, has hosted what I would argue is unique mostly about contemporary criminal justice relative to, say, Tocqueville's, is not only have we doubled down on formal institutional responses, in large part as a consequence of our ignorance of how effective informal processes are. Like nobody has trust that like communities can respond to crime. We think it has to be a governmental answer. We have to turn to sort of men's with guns and legislation and so on and so forth to solve our community crimes. That's a big problem. But the second issue, I think, is what you're pointing out, is these forms of like legislative overhauls that are taking place. In the courtroom, for example, the courtroom is a microcosm of federalism, right? You have a check and balance between a prosecutor, a judicial branch, and the jury is supposed to be the sort of last line of civil defense, that the people can stand up and say, this is all bullshit, right? Like they could stand up and say, I don't think that this should even be a crime. I think that guy's shirt is cool. Like the sanctity of jury secrecy, right, was built in to our legislative process and for like as long as the common law existed. But what you've seen in the 20th century is that the judicial, the judge and the legislator, have basically usurped a tremendous amount of that discretionary authority from the functional valve of jury systems and the sort of checks and balances accomplished in the plaintiff and the defendant. You see the same thing happening in regard to state versus federal jurisdictions with regard to something like the drug war, right? Most countries around the world criminalize drugs, right? Our prison rates are ginormous in large part because of the war on drugs. No one else launches a war on drugs. Lots of people put it on the books and they say, oh, you can't smoke pot on the street corner and you can't like shoot up heroin on your way to work. Those are, we can argue whether or not they're reasonable rules, reasonable laws, but administering the enforcement of those laws with federal funding, federal incentive programs, right? The federal criminal system comes into local jurisdictions and says, we're going to let you keep what you confiscate from drug dealers. We're going to give you equipment to staff your local prison, drug enforcement task force, right? No one else sort of subsidizes it with that sort of like collective issue. So like these types of legislations that degrade the potential constitutional checks and balances, I think, are very dangerous because you don't really notice for long periods of time. And general civic activism is very much apathetic towards disenfranchisement of the criminal class, which again is a function of our unique characteristics of American democracy. We have a diversified, heterogeneous society, right? And when we've been crowded out from our ability to build civic associations with this, right? That means that we don't have anything else to rely upon, right? We don't have the volunteer charity networks that can fill in where people are automatically turning to the state because these things are sort of crowding one another out. In the background of my presentation, you could easily put data from, say, Robert Putnam's work on the decline of civil associations in the United States. New Orleans, like we're anathema to this. We've got a lot of civic society relative to other places. That's sort of why people like us, right? Mutual aid and pleasure clubs, second lines. We've got Mardi Gras crews. We've got all sorts of community engagement projects. We're a unicorn compared to other cities in the United States.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.